Perhaps the most interesting part of studying history and historical events isn't necessarily learning all the facts, the plot twists, people, and maybe influences that had an effect on them, but more along the line of actually digging in deep enough to be able to understand events and people in the context of the time period when they actually happened. This video is about the 1955 Indianapolis 500, and if you're already versed in history, you know it stands out for the tragic events in the race, but like me, I'm guessing there's an element of the story surrounding this race that you're not as familiar with, and that will be the central part of this exploration. Of the things that are generally known about the Indy 500 in the 1950s, a few of them are complete general knowledge. It was a race dominated by a certain kind of car, known as a roadster, and a certain type of engine, which was, of course, the Offenhauser four-cylinder, usually of 270 cubic inches displacement. What's less generally known, and that I'll show you in black and white today, is that fans, racers, and even car builders were already bored and largely fed up with the fact that the event had become all but a cookie-cutter affair mechanically. Yes, it was a battle of great racing drivers, but for so much of its history, it was a battle of great racing machines and great racing drivers. The lament of the race's evolution from a proving ground of manufacturing technology to a specialized contest limited to specialized machines was actually palpable. This isn't a hot take I'm creating here, and through my research in a myriad of different publications like Speed Mechanics, Speed Age, Sports Illustrated, Motor Life, Hot Rod, Motor Trend, and books like that of the late Brock Yates, his entitled Against Death and Time, I was able to understand the feelings about the race in the words written by contemporaries of the event who were there to see it, live it, and feel it each year. The bottom line is you simply don't need to speculate when consuming first-hand accounts of events as they were actually recorded by eyewitnesses. Headlines like Meyer-Drake Marathon and Boredom at the Brickyard populated newspapers and magazines, setting the tone in 1955. But before those headlines were published, in fact, before the race was run, there was a wildly optimistic period across the automotive media world that beat a single drum in unison. The battle cry? Finally, 1955 will be different. There were daring experiments coming to the Speedway again. There was a foreign company supposedly gearing up to take on America's best. Perhaps the most exciting thing of all, there were new and cool engines set to make their attempt at assaulting the all-conquering Offie four-cylinder. And of course, there was Bill Vukovich. By 1955, the man they called Vukie, or sometimes the Mad Russian, despite the fact of him being a very quiet man who was in fact not Russian, had established himself as the king of the Speedway. He came first to the track to race in 1950, and it was a quiet first impression as he did not qualify for the race. Returning in 1951, he made the grid in the 20th position, and then after 29 laps, he was forced off the track with an oil leak. In 1952, the world finally got their first look at the man who would be king. He qualified his car 8th, turned the fastest lap of the race at 135.135 miles per hour, and led 150 laps. In fact, he was cruising with relative ease to a first Indy 500 victory when the steering in his car broke, forcing him out with 9 laps to go. Completing 191 of the 200 laps, he was listed as the number 17 finisher. The nation had 2 simple questions about this near-miss hero. Who was this guy, and where did he come from? This hard-charging man with the interesting last name had been racing for the better part of 14 years before he appeared at Indy in 1950. He had battled on dirt and track roadsters, jalopies, and ultimately in midgets driving for Vic Edelbrock's team. He was a West Coast champion in 1945 and 46, and in 1950 was the AAA National Midget Champion. A man on the rise with a performance to match. All he needed now was the right car. And there just so happened to be 2 guys who knew exactly what that machine should be, and they had the financial backing to make it all happen. Howard Keck was the wallet. The son of Myron Keck, who founded the Superior Oil Company of California, he ran the business now and grew it into a company he would eventually sell for nearly $6 billion. The racing brains behind his crew were Jim Travers and Frank Kuhn, 2 brilliant mechanics under the employ of Keck who approached Frank Curtis with their concept for what they thought to be the perfect race car. They wanted Curtis to build one of his chassis, but to offset the Offenhauser engine to the left and then rotate the engine over 36 degrees to the right. This would place the engine lower in the chassis, bringing the center of gravity down, as well as placing weight on the left side of the car to aid in its only job of turning left as at high a speed as was possible. The third member of their team was a whiz with fuel systems, particularly fuel injection setups, and his name was Stu Hilborn. As proof you never really know who's watching you in racing, Howard Keck had seen Bill Vukovich at the 1951 Indy 500. Now, in his short time on the track, Vukie had captured Keck's attention. He was a charger, carving up into the field, moving from his 20th starting spot to 10th in just 15 laps. He was also a known commodity on the midget tracks and rough dirt racing scene of the era. Now, Keck was losing his driver, the multiple-time winner Maury Rose, who had captured 3 Indy 500s, and he was going to retire after the 1951 race, so he needed a driver. With the stipulation that Vukovich quit midget racing for his own health and well-being, Keck hired him as the team driver. Now, it seems that Vukovich ran the entire 1951 AAA championship car season after the Indy 500. Now, he had lackluster results, and it would be the last time that Vukovich would go out and chase the championship trail. And so this brings us back to 1952, where we now know that this new roadster, as it was being called, was clearly the next evolutionary step forward in Speedway performance. Like it had been done so many times before, the design was copied from here to eternity. Builders like A.J. Watson and a host of others put their spin on it, but frankly, there was so much work and so many orders, Frank Curtis couldn't have been that mad. He was building his cars as fast as he could, and every other shop seemed to be doing the same thing. When the month of May rolled around in 1953, Bill Vukovich knew a couple of things. Firstly, he'd be leaving his small gas station and repair shop in California for a month, and secondly, he was going to win the Indy 500. He had made it look so easy in 1952 before the steering failure. He knew that a win wasn't just achievable, but he felt like anything less would be an embarrassment. In front of 190,000 people and in ambient temperatures nearing 100 degrees, Vukovich drove as if he were a man possessed. Qualifying on the pole, Vukovich led 195 of 200 laps. In fact, he had lapped the entire field 150 laps into the race. Many drivers dropped out due to heat and suffering from heat exhaustion. In fact, one competitor, Carl Scarborough, died in the infield care center. Heat frustration was a major factor in his demise. Several drivers bailed out and had relief drivers finish the race for them, but Vukovich did not. On his final pit stop, he drank some water, dumped some water down his shirt, and sped off. He won the race by 3 minutes and 30 seconds. This was as complete a domination as anyone had ever put on an entire field of race cars at the Speedway. He was awarded $89,496 for his win, and typically drivers got about 40% of what they won, so let's call it roughly $36,000 going into his pocket, more than $400,000 in today's cash. As the rest of the teams were headed to the next race in Milwaukee, Bill Vukovich was headed home. The only other race he attended in the series was the Sacramento event where he failed to qualify. Now, this was a weird thing to do, and race promoters kind of hated him for it. The winner of the Indy 500 was a major promotional aspect of these AAA championship car races, and the fact that he wasn't showing up did not help them to sell tickets. But frankly, that wasn't Bill Vukovich's plan. He had cars to fix and a family to be with, and there would always be next May, and he'd make sure the other racers wouldn't mind him missing a few events. So in 1954, he did just that. The scene was different than 1953, though. His car, cutting edge when it showed up in 1952, was now a couple years older, and through refinement and tinkering, the other cars were simply better working and more sorted out. Qualifying was a struggle. Vukovich started all the way back in the 19th position on the inside of the 7th row, and then he furrowed his brow and went to work. On lap 61, he found the front, fell back, and then battled until lap 92 when he regained the lead and held it for 38 laps until a pit stop. After that final stop, he slashed his way to the front, grabbing the lead on lap 150 and never looking back, driving away from second-place Jimmy Bryan by over 1 minute's time. This time the victory was shared with an estimated 175,000 people. And if you notice the trend, it's not great. The crowds at the Indy 500 in the early 1950s were declining. Was interest? Certainly not in the heroic Vukovich, who joined Wilbur Shaw, who had won back-to-back in 1939 and 40, as well as Maury Rose, who Vuki replaced and who was a back-to-back winner in 1947 and 48. Now, Vukovich was among the giants now, and unlike them, his mastery of the Speedway was singular, and that seemed to be enough for him. He did race Milwaukee, didn't finish, and is listed as the number 22 finisher. After that, Bill Vukovich went home. There'd always be next May, and with another massive paycheck in his pocket, his family was sitting on a very nice nest egg. Not to mention the fact that he was the most famous service center operator in America. Now, all that was really nice for Bill Vukovich, but there were larger concerns than him as far as the Indy 500 went. The crowds had declined by tens of thousands in the first few years of the 50s, and in 1954 an interesting milestone was achieved. The entire starting field was Offenhauser engines. Not a single Novi or other power plant had even cracked the quick 33. Previous years, there had been at least two oddballs in there, be they the Novi or, like in 1952, a Ferrari, or even the amazing Cummins diesel of 1952. But aside from them, everything else was uniform. But in 1954, everybody had an Offie. The automotive media had begun pointing out this lack of mechanical diversity years before, but the whole field now being under Offie power, they let loose pretty hard after the 54 event. Motor Trend dubbed it the Meyer-Drake sweepstakes, and their entire race report was a question of the race's modern meaning and then a slew of suggestions on how to change it more to their liking. Many other publications echoed the same sentiments, but there was one important group of people who didn't. The racers, car owners, and participants. There were no rules against doing something different at Indy, but there was seemingly no reason to go against the well-established grain, right? A Curtis Craft or similar facsimile and a 270 cubic inch Offie were the tools of the trade because the rules had kind of made them the best option. People on Gasoline Alley grumbled about it and whined about it and talked about the glory days of the 30s and 20s when it was an anything-goes style of race, but really nobody did anything to change it. But there is something awesome that happens in racing, and thankfully, this is the thing that happens when the majority of people seemingly have something figured out. There is always a small faction of defiant ones that will rise, some from nowhere, others from within the rank and file, all obsessed with breaking the mold and applying their own ideas. This small group of men was singing the siren song that the media was begging to hear, and boy, once the media caught the first note, they were hooked. Suddenly, after a couple of unique projects were discovered and a few rumors chased, the racing media leapt to the tops of their desks, and the Indianapolis 1955 500-mile race was set to be the year of wide-open experimentation that the event had lacked since the 1930s. Motor Life's title screamed streamliners and unusual engines marked the start of new experimental cycle. Hot Rod proclaimed they're getting radical at Indy. Streamliners, bubble canopies, and power steering make their debut. Driver-to-crew radio will speed pit stops. Now, the stories mostly covered the same collection of oddballs and freaks destined for the Speedway in 55, and most stunning was the Sumar Streamliner. This was a Curtis 500D chassis like basically everybody else was using, a 270 cubic inch Offenhauser engine like basically everybody else was using, but it had a gorgeous hand-formed metal body covering every inch of the car and used a bubble canopy over the driver. Chapman Root funded the project. His family business was in the manufacture of glass bottles, and the Root family just so happened to have the patent on the bottle that Coca-Cola went into. They did okay for themselves. Regarding the car, if looks meant anything, the Sumar Streamliner was going to blow the field into the weeds with Jimmy Dewalt behind the wheel. Hot rodding legend Sandy Ballon had his own take on streamlining in the Indy 500. He had Quinn Epperly fashion a custom body for his Curtis chassis. Now, this car was also due to have a clear canopy to move the air around the driver's compartment. The car was to have a two-way radio mounted in the headrest behind the driver to open communication between the driver and team for pit stops. The tires were left in the open to allow proper cooling of both them and the brakes, as there was some concern that covering them totally up may cause advanced tire wear or trap excess heat in the braking system. So allowing them to be out in the open, in theory, would allow proper cooling and extend the lives of both. Belland had made his fortune in exhaust systems and made so much money in so many exhaust systems, he had built his own foundry in Los Angeles to make his own exhaust pipe. This guy had the cheese just like the glass bottle family. Now, while these streamlined cars that were planned to debut were basically dressed-up Curtiss chassis, there was plenty of interesting stuff on the engine side, starting with Ferrari. The company at last entered a car in 1952, and because of a wheel failure, it didn't fare well. Known as one of the world's best racing engine manufacturers, the press was abuzz when rumors kicked up that Ferrari had created a six-cylinder engine capable of making 400-plus horsepower, and the engine weighed less than the 330-horsepower Affi 270. Designed by Oriello Lampretti, the Bardal Company was the sponsoring force, and Bardal actually shipped a pair of Curtiss chassis to Modena, Italy, to have the engines fitted and prepared for the 500. This was the kind of thing that many people had been waiting years for. The joining of a great chassis and a global leader in racing engines coming together to create some sort of a super weapon that may stop the Offenhauser grip on the race. Herb Porter, who had been working for years to properly supercharge a four-cylinder Offenhauser engine, was back with his latest creation. The engine, a centrifugally supercharged unit, sat at roughly 180 cubic inches, which was the limit for blown engines at the time, and made 575 horsepower at 6,000 RPM. The engine was designed for use in an arcane Curtiss 500A chassis. Remember, at this point in history, we were up to the 500D. Now, that 500A chassis that the supercharged engine was going into was thought to be, perhaps, the very last one in use, which was getting one of the most powerful engines in the field. Does not seem like great math. Willie Utzman and Chuck Day worked in creating a dual overhead camshaft Studebaker V8 engine. Now, there is actually two of these. The original version was 273 cubic inches, and a second engine was built at 283 cubic inches. Leo Goosen, incidentally, had a big hand in designing these dual overhead cam Studebaker V8s. Now, both engines were capable, supposedly, of making 400 horsepower in the dyno, and they both found a home for the race. One landed in the number 98 car owned by J.C. Agajanian, which was driven by Chuck Day himself. The second was planned for a chassis originally made for Henry Banks in 1951. Next up, and perhaps most amazingly, was Tony Capanna with an iron Chrysler Hemi. Capanna had been tapped by Al Dean to provide a Hemi power plant for the car Jimmy Bryant had raced at the 500 the year before. This was the same car Bryant had driven to the AAA Champion Car Series National Championship. Now, Capanna was well known for operating the Wilcap Company, which was both a aftermarket parts manufacturer and an engine-building machine shop outfit. He had built record-setting engines for the Bonneville Salt Flats, as well as many drag racing engines, so his ability to make power was absolutely unquestioned. Could that power last for 500 miles? Could a big, stock-headed iron lump of Chrysler Hemi actually compete at the Indy 500? Now, Tony Capanna knew he had a 268 cubic inch ball of fury, and he had all the faith in the world that it could run. It may have given up a little peak horsepower, but a V8 would make plenty of torque in a more reasonable rev range than the Affi, and he did have an ace up his sleeve. Few people on the planet knew nitromethane and how to use it like Tony Capanna. If he needed more power, it could come out of the magic nitro can, and this was not a man who was afraid to tip it. As for everyone else, it was going to be more of the same. In fact, while many of the magazine and media outlets praised this group of outlaws for doing their own thing, they virtually all said that these ideas were at best in their infancy and would need time to evolve, and at worst were doomed to fail from the moment of their conception. They also said in their pre-race coverage that betting against the establishment in a normal-style roadster with a normal-style Affi, no matter how seductive these new concepts were, was a folly. Not shockingly, they kind of nailed it. For starters, the Bardal Ferrari never showed up. Not in 1955 and not any year after it. Some people have said that the whole thing was a clever ploy for Enzo Ferrari and the boys to get an all-expense-paid peek at a Curtiss chassis. Others have said that the project was brushed aside for more pressing matters in 1955 and never revived. No matter the reason, the car really would have been cool to see and hear. The streamliners. Yeah, not so good as streamliners. Jimmy Daywalt made a bunch of laps with the full body on the Sumar Streamliner, and he was petrified of it. He claimed the car was trying to take flight at around 140 miles an hour, so he kept the speeds below that. Outside of the lift issues, there was a problem of not being able to see the front tires. Indy 500 drivers like to see the left front, especially for placing the car in the corners, and there was no seeing it under the body. Stripping off all the curvaceous panels, the car actually qualified 17th and finished 9th. Of course, that made it basically the most ugly Curtiss in the field, but it ran well, and Daywalt drove it well, but just look how ugly this thing is. It just looks industrial. Pretty crazy. It would be a scant couple of years later that Marshall Teague would be killed in this car at Daytona International Speedway while trying to set the closed-course speed record before the first running of the Daytona 500. Whether the body had anything to do with it or a tire failed, Teague was killed when the car impacted the wall. The Balon Miracle Power Special started 20th and ended up 14th with the same awkward body it had showed up with. Additionally, one of the other big talked-about points of the car was the trick use of a two-way radio. That was a complete bust, as it was on the same frequency as local law enforcement. So the entire time it was picking up an endless stream of police calls and ended up being utterly useless. Neither of the radical dual overhead cam Studebakers made the 1955 Indy 500 starting grid. Interestingly, the first time the Leo Goosen design engine had been at the Speedway was 1952, and in that attempt, the starter had actually twisted the nose off of the crankshaft clean off, stopping any chance that Alan Heath had to qualify that year. The dual overhead cam Studebaker would show back up 1 year later in 56, this time with the great Dick Rathman at the wheel, and it would fail to qualify for the field of 33. While all this stuff is interesting, there's one power plant left we haven't followed up on, the Tony Capanna Hemi. As mentioned, Tony Capanna was very well known out west for his string of record-setting engines on the Bonneville Salt Flats and other places, and as Dean had sprung for a new Offie-powered Kuzma Roadster for the 55 race so Jimmy Bryant could drive it, his runner-up car from 1954 was seen as a rolling laboratory. This was the car that Capanna's engine was to end up in. Now, it should be mentioned that the car we're talking about here was basically a dirt sprint car and far different in many, many ways than the roadsters the car would be competing against. The fact that Bryan drove this car to a runner-up in 1954 was an incredible testament to his skills as a wheelman and his outright bravery. It really had no business being in the same ring as a roadster, but as a test experiment, it was the perfect platform. Capanna and the team's chief mechanic, Clint Bronner, modified the chassis to take the small Hemi engine. Now, Capanna had built two of them. One was a qualifying engine, which was a Dodge. Now, the Dodge had lighter internals and a more radical setup, as it only had to live for 10 miles. The second engine was a DeSoto. It was designed to run on methanol only, had beefier guts, and was much more of an anvil designed to take the 500 miles of punishment. Lastly, the qualifying engine was to be run on a very strong load of nitromethane. Now, some people had the guts to run up to 25% in their Offenhausers when desperate for power. Capanna's qualifying engine is reported in multiple sources to have been run on 85% nitromethane, which is absolutely and completely insane. The other insane thing? It was going to work. Bryan actually took the car out for test laps and ran over 140 miles per hour unofficially and was able to make a string of laps in the high 130s without breaking a sweat. And then, a minor disaster. When he really decided to lean on it, one of the freeze plugs shot out of the back of the block and unleashed a torrent of hot water into the cockpit. Now, despite hot feet, Bryan didn't crash. He did abandon ship quickly, but as Bryan had a shiny new Kuzma Offie car to race, he got out of the hot-foot and Hemi and got in to his machine, but Bob Christie got the nod to drive the Hemi-powered dirt car. On the final day of qualifying, Christie took some warm-up laps and indicated he was ready to go for it. He slammed the throttle down, and about one-third of the way down the backstretch on his first qualifying lap, it all went wrong. The crank literally threw itself out of the bottom of the block, taking all the main webs with it. Locked the engine up tight, skidded the car around. It spun several times, but thankfully Christie wasn't harmed, and the car itself wasn't damaged too badly. Capanna discovered a blockage in the oiling system that was determined to be the root of this costly nightmare. Now, Tony Campana would continue to show up at the Indy 500 with Hemi engines through 1958 before he finally packed it in at the Speedway. Now, if you've lost count by now, and I don't blame you, with the failures of these projects, specifically the engines, the entire field of 33, for the second time in the history of the race, were all running the same brand of engine. Offenhauser had officially and utterly conquered the Speedway. No Hemis, no Novis, no Fords, no anything else. But now to the race itself and the defining story of the 1955 Indianapolis 500-mile race. What's so interesting is how the event was covered by different publications. Car magazines harped on the event for being boring and homogenized, but places like Sports Illustrated concentrated on the human element. Motor Trend entitled their story Boredom at the Brickyard, while Sports Illustrated entitled theirs Victory and Death at the Brickyard. The car magazines brushed off the multiple tragic deaths over the span of May in a paragraph or less. Usually they only mentioned one of the lives lost, and in doing so, using kind of fleeting and soft language to do it. Not so the Sports Illustrated story. Tragedy had come to the Speedway long before the race even began in 1955, as Manny Aiello had been killed in practice. He'd been a very good driver in his own right and a front-runner on a few occasions at the Speedway. His car piled into the concrete wall in Turn 1. He did linger overnight, dying the next day in the hospital, leaving a wife and children to mourn. Race day in 1955 was strange. It was cold, as it had been for a long stretch in Indy. It had been raining incessantly as well. Jerry Hoyt, a total unknown, had virtually stolen the pole for the race when his team, wittingly or not, defied an unofficial silent agreement amongst teams in the pits during qualifying to sit one of the days out because of poor weather and potentially damp track conditions. Rolling out a half an hour before qualifying would close and running 140 miles per hour, no one else could catch Hoyt with the limited time remaining, and he was able to start from the front of the pack for the first and only time in his life. His position didn't survive the first lap. Jack McGrath started on the outside of row 1 and Vukovich in the middle of row 2. By the 20th lap, it was a two-horse race, with McGrath and Vukovich outpacing the field by a ton. Guys like Bob Swikert were battling for a distant and fading third place. Just after lap 50, McGrath had an engine issue, drove into the pits, and was done. Vukovich was out front by himself now, and there was no one else even really in the conversation. He was starting to check up on people that he was going to be lapping in the very near future. Once he got around them, he'd be in the crystal clear for many laps until he caught the next pack of cars slower than him. And then lap 56 happened, and the course of Indy 500 history was violently and irreparably altered forever. A yellow flag flew. The entire field slowed. On the backstretch, something was definitely on fire, as the column of black smoke would indicate to the grandstands. Teams watched and waited with bated breath to see their cars slowly circle by. A few were missing. Roger Ward, Al Keller, Johnny Boyd, Ed Elysian, and Bill Vukovich. Officials approached Travers and Kuhn on pit road, told them something, and the men reacted as if they had seen a ghost. Finally, after what seemed an excruciating period of time, the track announcer, the famed Tom Carnegie, came over the PA and said, quote, "Bill Vukovich has been fatally injured," unquote. The driver, who seemed to be headed toward Indy 500 immortality as a 3-time back-to-back-to-back winner, doing something nobody had ever done before, was dead, and he was dead because of a horrific wreck on the back straight. Roger Ward had spun and flipped his car, which had magically landed on its wheels. It was sitting in the middle of the track facing the wrong way. Al Keller, Johnny Boyd, and now Vukovich all approached the scene at speed. As the cars darted different directions to avoid Ward, Boyd lost control and flipped his car over. Vukovich swerved right to miss Boyd. Catching the tire of Johnny Boyd's car, his machine shot toward the right as he had the wheel turned right as well, crashing into the low wooden guardrail in the back straight of the Speedway. This launched his car into a sickening series of pinwheeling flips through the air before it smashed down on a spectator's car, bounced across a large truck of some sort, and then finally crashed through a Jeep before landing upside down and on fire in the parking area. Vukovich was dead long before he hit the ground. Boyd, despite his own high-speed mess, walked away with no injuries. The wreck most deeply changed the life of Roger Ward, who had been a hard-living, hard-partying racer. After this moment, he reformed his life, became a man of faith, and would go on to be a 2-time Indianapolis 500 winner and a true American hero on the racetrack. As for the rest of the race, it was interesting to say the least. With the wreck taking down some of the biggest names, Jimmy Bryan roared to the lead in his new car, being chased by local Indiana boy Bob Schweikert. The two battled back and forth before a fuel pump parked Bryan, a man who likely should have won the race. With 250 laps to go was a group of a couple of veterans and some new guys that no one really knew. The crowd, listed at somewhere around 160,000 people, began to pull for the local kid Schweikert. His own team seemed to doubt their chances to win because of their last pit stop on lap 133 was going to have them precariously close to being out of fuel by the end of the race. And despite a lead, their young driver was defying orders to slow down and pace his time to save fuel. Schweikert drove the car masterfully, if not faster than his crew wanted, and he won the race. It was the 29-year-old's first time finishing the Indy 500 in 4 attempts. He battled wind, loads of oil on the track, the distraction of one of the most tragic accidents in Indy history, and all the other elements that came his way to succeed. It seems quite fitting that Schweikert, a relative unknown to most of the Indy 500 fan base, would be the man to pick up the mantle left behind by Bill Vukovich's passing. He also won the race for John Zink, who was a longtime supporter of the Indy 500 and a man who had invested piles and piles of money to achieve victory. It should be noted that late in the race, Cal Naday wrecked severely and was nearly killed, spending lots of time in the hospital and months in rehabilitation to get back to her normal life. He would have been the 3rd Speedway fatality that year if not for the work of skilled doctors on site and in the area. The aftermath of the race was interesting and it was predictable. Questions arose about the future of the event. Was it barbarism to continue to do this? Was it too reckless to continue? Were the cars too fast? Should parts be coming from regular passenger cars? Would mandating stock block engines actually fix anything? Is the race just doomed? All of these questions were swirled through magazines, newspapers, and bench racing conversations, and the end result? Nothing, really. The show went on. Most of the cars raced in Milwaukee the week after the 500 and went on with their seasons. Racers like Jimmy Bryan would go on to win their own Indy 500 crowns and then die ingloriously in race cars, usually on some far-flung dirt track in front of a small-town crowd. It was simply what men did back then, and they trooped on. If the Indy 500 of 1955 changed anything, it was the idea that experimentation was not only welcome but encouraged, even if it failed miserably. We'd see far more of it through the 1950s, 60s, and into the 70s until things once again found their level and a package was discovered, a style of race car refined that would come dominating once again. So now we know. If you want to sit around and lament the loss of creative genius at the Indy 500 in modern times, you could be having the same conversation fans and racers had more than 70 years ago. It's wild, right? We always look back at this era in racing and think about how innovative and how open and free it was. But the reality of the situation was, in the 1950s, the Indy 500 was trapped inside a box of its own making. And it would take Jack Brabham showing up in 1961 with his rear-engine Repco race car to start to break the mold. And as we know, it would be multiple years after that before things truly had a groundswell of change. It's an amazing thing to think back on. It's an amazing thing to look back on. And the life of Bill Vukovich is one of the most interesting in racing history. He was a man who had complete mastery of one particular racing facility in the world, and it just so happened to be the most famous racetrack on the planet. Vukovich was 36 years old when he died. His son would go on to be an incredibly strong racer, a Rookie of the Year at the Indy 500, as well as his grandson would go on to also be a successful racer, unfortunately dying on the racetrack in a crash. It is an amazing thing to think about that Bill Vukovich, after all these years, still stands among the tallest and largest giants in the history of the Indianapolis 500. His loss was a huge one for the sport at the time, but as we know, especially in auto racing, the show must go on. I'm Brian Loans. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more racing history, automotive history, and stories from our high-speed and high-octane past. I'll see you next time.